Hey guys, Stockaholics, thank you guys for being here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about copper today. I got my mind on my copper and my copper on my mind. I am becoming concerned with the prices that we're starting to see in copper. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about what has happened from my views, which by the way, I'm just some guy on the internet. And I'm going to be talking about why I'm likely going to be taking profits on my investments that I started last year. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about the long-term bull case for copper. I mentioned this into some of the other videos where I was talking about the substance, but I thought it might be worth reiterating in the context that we should evaluate if anything has changed, right? So world's copper demand is going to continue to increase. I still think this is true. The developing world, it needs copper to electrify. A lot of the world still lives in abject poverty and they don't want to. And one of the substances they need to get out of that poverty is copper, right? The Western world is going to continue to invest in green technology, which requires tremendous amounts of copper. The zeitgeist in the West says we need to be concerned about global warming. And to meet these goals, we're going to need a lot of copper, right? So an electric vehicle, for example, uses approximately 3 times as much copper as a conventional vehicle. Now, there's two sides to this, right? That's the demand side. And there's the supply side, right? So at the same time, if you look at a kind of a graph of world copper mine grades, at the same time, the average grade of copper mines in the world continues to decrease. The average grade of a mine, for example, decades ago was much higher than it is now. So we're seeing huge, potentially huge increases in demand throughout the world, as well as less of the stuff being readily available. Now, if you listen to any kind of copper CEO, they'll be sure to let you know all about these two things, and they're true. I think that they're right on this regard. This is, again, the long-term bull case. Okay, so this is a slide I made from my last video when I was talking about copper, which I believe was in November, somewhere around there, when I made the last update on copper. It's been a while. And at the time, the price of copper was $3.55. Now, when I made that video, I mentioned that above $3 in copper price, I consider that to be kind of a high price for copper, and below $3 is kind of a low price for copper. This isn't like probably the most fairest way to think about copper because it's not taking into account inflation. And I think if you look at a lot of charts for copper, a lot of them tend not to be inflation adjusted for whatever reason. So if you, for example, let's say, you know, the price at this slide was $3.50, that's not really the same as the price in 10 years earlier, right? Now, that doesn't really change that there's probably some psychological impacts when price gets to certain points and all of those kinds of things. But I still kind of maintain this view that if it's above $3, it's starting to get expensive. And if it's below $3, it's kind of cheap, right? Something else I wanted to mention from this slide is that copper, you'll notice that the price tends to go way up right before a recession happens in a lot of these historical charts. And that's because copper is kind of a leading indicator on the economy in general. Sometimes it's called Dr. Copper for being such a great leading indicator of the how an economy is doing. But that's from the demand side. And what I think a lot of this move is, which I'm going to talk a little bit more, is yes, some demand side, but also a simultaneous supply side issue. And some of that, what's the popular phrase, could be transitory. As of today, the price of copper is $4.34. So we are way above what I would normally consider to be a high zone. And it's, well, I think when I tried to make this, I was going to make this video on Friday, and I was like, okay, when I had a little time, and I was like, okay, then the price was $4.27. So since then, the price has increased by 7 cents. Now, from the long-term thesis, I thought that at some point, yes, we would achieve $4.30. I did not think that this wouldn't happen someday. But when I made my investments and when I made those videos last time, I didn't think that these would happen within months of that. I thought it would, the time frame I was thinking was kind of years out. Yeah. So I kind of have to ask myself, you know, how much of this move is truly demand driven, and how much of this is supply, or how much of this is, stimulus related. Like I mentioned before, usually price rises follow strong economies. Are we really in the strongest economy ever? Well, if you're going to use copper, as and some other commodities as your indicator, sure. But I don't necessarily agree with that view. And we're in really high territory at this point. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys this to help put into context what I'm about to show you guys. It helps to keep in mind that Chile and Peru account for the majority of copper supply. If you look at Chile, it's double probably that of Peru. So when we look at these two suppliers of the metal, it really can put into context maybe some things that might be happening, at least from the supply side or the short-term supply side, on what's going on with the price of copper. Okay, I wanted to show you guys this to kind of put in context what I think is probably happening. These are the major producers, again, Chile and Peru. And something that a lot of people don't realize is that, kind of like tankers, the copper industry is also seasonal. So there are times in the year where production declines. I don't know exactly why this happens, but it always happens in January, February, March, April. So if you know why this is happening, let me know. But I do know that it exists, right? Same thing in Peru. You notice that every year around this time, it's a huge COVID drop last year from Peru. And it drops in those months. Now, if you look at where we are seasonally today, in January, February, March, April, we are at these low points, and Chile is below where they were last year. Again, Chile accounts for a tremendous amount of world supply, right? And even Peru is kind of getting there. We'll see what happens on their production, right? But right now we are in seasonal lows for copper production, and these lows are, like I mentioned, a little bit below the norm for Chile, the #1 copper producer in the world. I'd also like to mention that last year total world supply of the copper, for various reasons, because of COVID, because perhaps some anticipation that demand would be a little bit lower, reduced by 2%. All right, to put a little bit of this into context, I wanted to play a clip from Maverick of Wall Street. He makes daily updates on the stock market and a lot of his views on how he sees things playing out, the Federal Reserve, whatever. But in this video, he shows you what's going on with the prices of commodities overall, or, well, not all of the commodities, that not all of them behave like this, but there's a tremendous amount that do. And so you kind of have, when you look at all of these things happening, at least from a copper lens, you kind of have to wonder what's going on overall, and is this supportive or of a long-term bull thesis of copper, or does it kind of show you that something 2 + 2 is not exactly equaling 4 here, right? Is this long-term bull thesis actually what's happening for the price of copper's movements?
You could see spending pick up pretty substantially in the second half of the year. And that would be a good thing, of course, but it could also put upward pressure on prices. And I would just say that essentially it doesn't seem likely that would result in very large increases or that they would be persistent. We've all been living in a world for a quarter of a century and more where all of the pressures were disinflationary, pushing downward on inflation. We've averaged less than 2% inflation for more than the last 25 years. Inflation dynamics do change over time, but they don't change on a dime. And so we don't really see how a burst of fiscal support or spending that doesn't last for many years would actually change those inflation dynamics. I will also say there's forecasters need to be humble and have a great deal to be humble about, frankly, but
Now, I've always made several videos on how I see different monetary kind of phenomenon, inflation, deflation, kind of that stuff. And I've kind of always maintained that I thought that inflation was likely. There was going to be higher than average inflation because of stimulus. But I think that we should keep in mind that the environment that we've been in over the last year is one that has been both very beneficial, at least especially in the United States, but some other Western countries too. It's been very beneficial to the average consumer. They've had higher than normal incomes. And at the same time, a lot of those people have had lower than normal expenses. So that we've seen a lot of things like mortgage moratoriums, rent deferments, those kinds of government policies. And I'm talking about from the lens of the United States. This could be different in some other Western countries. I'm not assuming that they would be the same everywhere. So I think a lot of this has led to some increased consumption, and at the same time, we've seen some decreased supply from those copper miners not anticipating this, and also having their issues with maintaining safety for their miners because of the COVID environment, right? So one of the questions I ask myself is how much of this is sustainable, right? Is this sustainable demand that we've been seeing? Is this sustained long term? Is this supportive of the bull thesis for copper? Or is all of this free money, if you will? Is it going to continue? And is it going to continue to support these very high commodity prices? All right, I'd like to show you guys a couple more things. The things I'm about to show you are more anecdotal, but I think that they at least show my point of view on what I think is happening, right? So if I look at Google Trends, and if I were to go on there and I would search copper stocks, you would notice that we are way above the mean, I guess, if in the interest in these, and you can see that it's been trending up recently. There's been a very high interest in copper stocks, copper in general. And if you look at some other things, the vast retail interest in the commodity. Like I said, I made a few videos on this before, and one of the videos that I made on the long-term bull thesis for copper is continued to be one of the videos that has been the most popular over the long-term view. I think actually probably the single greatest viewed channel or greatest viewed video on my channel has been the video where I laid out the bull thesis for copper. So there's a lot of interest in investing in copper, and as you guys know, hopefully if you've watched some of my videos, I'm kind of a contrarian. So when I see these kinds of things, it makes me a little nervous, right? So here's some articles. If you were to go on Seeking Alpha, copper demand from the auto industry is expected to double as the EVs ramp up. Now, if you look at the actual statistics on EV sales in 2020, they're a little bit lackluster, but as you may notice from this article, it's all expectations, right? This is from Goldman Sachs. Copper is on a path to 15,000 per ton in 2025 thanks to the green transition. Again, that's that long-term bull thesis from that Western narrative lens, right? If you will go search some videos on copper, you'll see some videos from CNBC. And if CNBC is talking about it, that makes me a little nervous. Goldman Sachs commodities research head on why he's bullish on copper. There's some other videos and articles. The commodity super cycle is here. And if there's probably, from their lens, there's some evidence to support that. If you look at all the massively high commodities that prices we've seen recently, right? So when I see tons of this mainstream coverage, I see articles everywhere, I see no bears, I start to get nervous. When I bought copper stocks last year, I expected to hold them for years before I saw a significant gain on them. I expected this to be largely driven by copper demand and not because of short-term drop in copper supply or because of a pumped and unseen stimulus demand, which is how I kind of see things happening recently. And my investment back then was largely based on the long-term bull thesis I laid out in the beginning of this video. Since then, I've seen a few of my copper investments double, and one of them has almost quadrupled. So, like I mentioned, I must ask, what has changed? Now, I think that the long-term fundamentals in copper, they remain good. The Western zeitgeist, it wants to overspend to meet carbon goals. I think that there's a lot of things that people in the Western nation, or sorry, I should clarify, governments would be willing to buy regardless of what the copper price is, right? Now, meanwhile, the developing world, they still have a continued desire to electrify. None of this has changed. This is all still true. Supply of the copper mines continue to degrade, meaning more mines need to be brought online in the future to meet world demand. But how much of what we are seeing is based on this thesis? That is what I need to ask myself, and that's what I've been asking myself. So if you compare copper to all kinds of the other commodities, like in the video by Maverick, all commodities have recently gone way up. Yeah, I think some of this move has clearly been caused by short-term fiscal stimulus, but all of these commodities still have supply and demand forces too. Human behaviors during COVID have been strange. They've been hard to predict. And I don't think that these moves are purely inflationary. If you look at gold, for example, it's been dropping in price. Dr. Copper, it's a saying that often means that copper is a great economic indicator. And to me, this makes sense if it's demand that is driving copper price. Yes, on the one hand, there was, I think, a 1% to 2% drop in supply from mine shutdowns last year. But are the fundamentals really driving this short-term sky-high price? And at what point does price become restrictive of demand? You know, if I want to buy a washing machine and the washing machine's price goes up by 50% because the commodity inputs have gone up by that much, am I still going to buy that said washing machine, or will I buy I'll do something else instead or whatever, right? So I think that these really high commodity prices, like Jerome Powell mentioned, could be restrictive of demand. Yeah. Now, there are mines around the world that can ramp up production too, to take advantage of these high prices. The common saying, the cure for high prices is often high prices. Now, I also got to ask myself, what happens when we exit the seasonally low mine output from Chile and Peru this year? And when we see fiscal stimulus in the Western countries start to dry up this summer, I also ask myself, or I think about the U.S. rent and mortgage moratoriums that we've seen this year too. Those are going to start to end. So what happens when all of these mortgages come due and people still need to start paying for those things, right? It's another headwind on I think all commodities, right? So for me, last year when I bought copper, nobody liked it. It was on nobody's radar. There was bears everywhere saying the economy will be in shambles for a while from the COVID plague. And now if you look, there's no bears anywhere. They're all hibernating. The mainstream media is pouring with excitement for copper. And if I look at all of these things, I see a few red flags. All right, so I'm still kind of a crazy deflationist. If you listen to some of Maverick's videos, that's probably what he would call me. Or maybe another better way to say is more of I'm a realist on inflation, and that I think that it's more likely to remain low rather than go piping hot indefinitely, especially when these easy money policies, they start to go away. It's hard for me to believe the deflationary forces of technology and from the COVID virus become irrelevant when, at least when we're talking about the deflationary forces of technology, they've been relevant for the past 20 years. Now, I could speculate that there would be more speculative stimulus money But that would be speculate, and that would cause more inflation. But that would be speculating that on a commodity that could get more expensive, that's already expensive. When I could easily speculate that inflation would affect other commodity prices to go up, like gold, for example, right? So it's for all of these reasons and uncertainty in the short term that I am deciding that I should probably keep it simple, as the saying goes. The price is now high. I think I should sell. Cyclicals aren't buy and hold forever stocks. Copper is a little different than, let's say, oil tankers. If that long-term thesis is really true, if there really is an underinvestment in copper, it can take years for new copper mines to come online. They're huge investments, and they take years to find reasonably great mines, pass environmental permitting, develop infrastructure. And if there really is an underinvestment in copper, it will take years to develop. And copper prices will continue to develop even higher than they are now, right? But I'm just not convinced that's what's taking place here. All right, so it's for these reasons that tomorrow I'm very likely to be selling significant portions of my copper stocks. Copper prices have risen over the weekend, so I wouldn't be surprised that there's another great green day on Monday to sell into. And it's not to say that I couldn't be wrong and that copper couldn't go even higher than it is from here. But I gotta keep it simple. When there's too many things that don't seem to be lining up, that don't seem to make sense, at least from my investment thesis, that it seems like a great place to take profits, and there are some great profits I'll be taking, so I'm very happy about that, at least. Anyway, I hope this information is useful. I hope that you guys come to your own conclusions on whatever it is that you decide to do, and I hope you guys have a great week.